So I guess our next speaker is going to be Dr. Bob Vernon from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. Many of you may have heard Dr. Vernon speak before or have heard about his work in wireworms. He, along with Christine and some other researchers across Canada, are doing quite a bit of work on wireworm. And Dr. Vernon's going to talk to us about the biology of wireworm and getting to know the beast a little bit better so that we know how to fight it. For anybody that's looking for seats that maybe came in late, I know there's some seats over here in this corner and there's a few over here as well. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much for bringing me all the way out here. It's always nice to get out to PEI. I've been out here about 2 or 3 times in the past, and one of these days I'm going to have to get out in the summertime, and so I can actually enjoy myself. But anyway, I'm going to talk about the biology of wireworms. And about 10 years ago, I gave a talk at the Entomological Society of Canada meeting. And the title of my talk was Tremors, Are We In for a Wireworm Plague in Canada? And at that time, I had decided, yes, I think we are in for a wireworm plague. And I think some of the information that you've just heard from the previous speakers backs that up. So the title of this talk is How to Arrest a Serial Killer. You got to know your enemy, okay, to be able to combat it. And I'd like to also acknowledge with this talk my technician, Dr. Van Herk, who does all of the wireworm identifications and is my partner in crime in Agassiz. And to do wireworm research, you need a lot of students, and over the years I've had probably 100 or more students working for me. So let's set the stage. Brian's gone over a little bit of this, but I'm going to elaborate on some of the details. We're not dealing with a single pest. We're not dealing with a Colorado potato beetle or a green peach aphid. We're dealing with up to 30 different species right across Canada. And probably, well, we've got different genera of wireworms, and they all have different morphologies. This is Salatosomus genus, the Limonius genus, the Agariotes genus, which is what your big problem is right now, I think, the Melanotus genus, and so on and so forth. And we all know that wireworms are the larval stage of click beetles, and this is an example of a click beetle. We've been doing a survey since 2004. And at that time, I was doing a lot of speaking across Canada and talking with different growers groups like yourselves. And beginning then, I started asking the different provinces to send me samples of wireworms that were showing up in their various crops so that we could identify them and get an idea of what the major pest species that were occurring across Canada were. And my technician, Van Herk, became one of the leading experts in wireworm taxonomy during this time, and he's the guy that does all of the identifications in Agassiz that we get. So we've been doing this now for, well, since 2004, and we're going to be continuing it in the foreseeable future, I guess, with some of this new Cluster 2 funding. So the main pest species today, and Brian showed this slide earlier, but what I want to point out here is that every province or every major growing area in Canada seems to have its own group of wireworm pests. And this is important to know. And I've expanded the Atlantic Canada number of species. There's about actually 8 species. 3 of them are exotic species that came in from Europe, probably in tall ships about 150 years ago. And they've invaded Atlantic Canada. Those are Agariotes obscurus, lineatus, and spatator. Spatator is also known as the potato wireworm in Europe. So that gives you an idea of its importance in other countries. We don't have it in BC yet, and we don't want it. Now, also setting the stage, a wireworm or a field may have one or multiple species. And this is very important to know. And whenever you see that little red asterisk come up there, that's something that I'd like you to keep in mind, okay? So Brian showed this slide earlier. These are the sites that we sampled with the help of Syngenta Canada back in 2010. They came up with a very nice kit that they gave out to growers and field reps. And they did a lot of sampling throughout the prairies. And there was 89 sites sampled in the prairies in 2010 with these kits. We found primarily two species, Selatosomus destructor, which is a very large and hungry wireworm. And there was a smaller species as well, Hypnoidus bicolor. And what we found was that many of these fields had more than one species. They had both of these species. So in 25 out of the 89 sites, we had more than one species. Now in PEI, we've been getting samples from some fields, 8 fields in the last year, all of which had at least 2 species of wireworms, not click beetles, but wireworms actually in the field. And one field had 5 different species. We're probably looking at 3 of the natural species that you have always had here, as well as a couple of the Europeans. And that's important. Now, why does this matter? Well, wireworm species differ in their habitat preferences. Okay, they differ in what soil types they like. They even have differences in the sort of crops that they will or will not eat. They have different life histories. So Selatosomus destructor, that big guy, he lives for about 4 to 5 years in the field. Agassiz obscurus, which you have here, lives for 4 to 5 years in the field. And depending on the sort of summers that are involved with a certain life cycle, it can be stretched out or it can be shortened. Okay? Spatator lives for 4 years, and that's the big one as far as I'm concerned in PEI. Hypnoidus bicolor, the little guy, 2 to 3 years, and this species, which we don't have, only lives for 1 year. So it goes through its entire life cycle in 1 year, and they have these in the States. They also differ in their susceptibility to insecticides. The neonicotinoids, for example, Titan, works great in British Columbia on Obscurus and Lineatus in the lab and in the field, and we always get good control. When they were trialed in PEI, we didn't get very good control, if any. And we don't know why. There might be a species difference. Well, we know that there's species differences. But in our lab studies, we've shown that certain insecticides will not kill certain species as well as other species. So we've actually shown this with the neonics. Pyrethroids, there's differences in susceptibility to pyrethroids. Most of these insecticides are repellent to wireworms. Biocontrols, my colleague Todd Kabluk is working on Metarhizium brunium, and he found that even between 2 very, very close species, Obscurus and Lineatus, you get very drastic differences in mortality with this fungus. And we're dealing with 30 species across Canada, okay? They differ in their behavior. They differ in the times that they come up to the surface or go down. And this affects the sampling accuracy. You can put traps in a field, and if you've got more than one species, you might catch one species but not the other. And I'll talk about sampling a little later. They differ in size and their feeding capacity. So here you have Selatosomus destructor, which is quite large. And size does matter in terms of how much they will eat. So the big guy is about 3 times larger than the little guy that we found both of them together in a lot of the prairie fields. So Destructor eats about 10 times more than Hypnoides bicolor. So you're going to have a different action threshold for Destructor than you are for bicolor. And once again, you've got right across Canada up to 30 different species that you're going to have to sort this all out if you want to come up with IPM programs. So knowing what species you're dealing with is of vital importance with respect to any wireworm research project, and especially efficacy trials. So if anybody here does efficacy trials, make sure that you put some bait balls out and collect the wireworms and give them either to Christine, or you can send them to us, and we'll get them identified. But it's very important that we know the species that you have in the field that you're doing your efficacy trials. And okay. And also the development of management strategies. You've got to know the species you've got in your area, because some insecticides won't work on certain species. Okay, that's important. Wireworm life cycle. And I credit this slide to Top Crop magazine. And basically, you start off with the adult stage, or the click beetles. And most species overwinter as click beetles. So the click beetles are actually produced the summer before. They spend the winter in the ground, and then they come out, in this case here, in May. And they mate and they lay eggs. And if anybody can't hear me in the back, just put your hand up and I'll smarten myself up. Okay. So after a week, maybe 2 weeks, the females start to lay eggs. And those eggs, in about 3 weeks, it takes 3 weeks for the eggs to hatch. And they hatch into what we term neonate wireworms. Okay? And they're very, very small, delicate wireworms. But remember that term, neonate. So that's in the first year. In the second year, you go into the resident stage, where the wireworms are resident in the fields for up to 3 to 5 years, depending on the species. And at the end of the wireworm cycle, they pupate. And after about 3 weeks, they turn into adults. The adults don't emerge. They stay in the soil and spend the entire winter in the soil. And then they come out and it starts all over again. And all this happens underground. And you can't see what's going on underground. You don't know what species you've got, what stage they're in. It's a very difficult insect to work with, and I wish that I had never gotten involved with wireworm research. And of course, the details vary between species. Okay, I'm going to start by talking about the click beetle stage. This is a photograph of Agaroides lineatus. And they're really quite an attractive insect. This just shows a bunch of different species. But the click beetle stage typically emerges in spring after overwintering, as I've said. And in British Columbia, this starts in late March. So we're well ahead of you guys out here. In BC, it peaks in early May, then it declines until July. And this just shows a study that we did in the Delta area. That's our primary potato growing area in BC. And the wireworms, or the click beetles, come out early April in this particular case. And they declined towards the end of June and into July. Now, during this time, you also have females. Okay, so this is this slide represents adults, or adult males in pheromone traps, but you've also got females that probably follow the same trends. And they're laying eggs during that time. And different species have different amounts of eggs that they can potentially lay. Okay, that's another difference with the species. So they can lay as little as 20 eggs or upwards to almost 1,000 eggs, depending on the species. The guys that we have here, the spit otter and lineatus and obscurus probably lay about 200 eggs each. Now, and I just mentioned this, but the emergence period of your click beetles will be later in PEI and likely involve more than one species. Okay, that's important. So where do they come from? Where do the click beetles come from? Where do they hang out? Well, typically they breed up populations in undisturbed, non-farmed habitats. Okay, so some permanent wireworm habitats is where you'll always have grass every year. You've got a grassy area like a ditch bank. Or in this case, it's a dike area surrounding the fields, which is always in grass. And you have enormous populations breed up in those areas because they're never treated with insecticide. They never see insecticide. So you've got a perfect habitat for them to build up. Other habitats are pasture, lawns, grassy road edges, and so on. Anywhere that you've got grass that's permanent, you've got wireworms in that area, and click beetles coming out every year. So they'll come out and they'll move into fields. So depending on what is in the field adjacent to where they've come out, they'll move in and they'll lay eggs. Okay, especially if the crop adjacent to the habitat, the permanent habitat, is suitable. Okay, so they'll either walk or they'll fly. And this is important. This just shows the movement of click beetles into a strawberry field from the edges. So this just shows that they're moving from the edge into the field. And about 3 weeks later, this whole area was full of click beetles laying eggs. That's in British Columbia. So they enter fields from these habitats directly by walking or by flying. And once again, depending on what species you have, they either do or don't fly. So Hypnoides bicolor, which is the very small species, flies very readily. It seems like the smaller the species, the more they fly. Obscurus lineatus and mancus, which we have here in PEI, they fly, but only when it gets kind of hot, maybe above 20 degrees usually. They'll start to fly. But they do prefer to walk. Spatotter is reportedly a strong flyer. And some of these species fly early in the season, or some fly later in the season. So what are the preferred egg-laying hosts of beetles coming out of permanent habitats? Well, obviously the habitat that they're in, okay, because they were whelped there. The population is quite happy there. So there will be a lot of egg laying in those permanent habitats. But they'll also move into adjacent fields with pasture, okay, because that's also a preferred host. Any grass, okay, cereal crops, wheat, barley, rye, oats. Grassy set-asides. In BC, we have set-asides that are in grass for 3 years for organic production, ultimately. And unknown others depending on the species. And there's an awful lot that we don't know about click beetle preferences for laying eggs. Okay? There's a lot we don't know. So what happens when immigrant beetles lay eggs in a field? Well, the beetles come in, say, to a field of grass, and they lay their eggs, and they hatch into neonates in 3 to 4 weeks. And the larvae, and in the case of PEI, you might be dealing with more than one species. They live and they feed for years in the soil. And the populations increase with the number of years that you're in any grassy crop. Okay, so if you were to grow wheat for 3 years, you'd be doomed. Of course, you don't do that. Okay? Now, another point I want to make, which is why we have problems, I think. If the field in question has had or has high levels of long residual organochlorines, like aldrin, dieldrin, heptachlor, DDT, which were used back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, those insecticides can persist in soil for 20, 25, 30 years. And we used a lot of these chemicals in the past, in the 50s, 60s, 70s. You probably used a lot of those chemicals here in PEI. And those insecticides, one application of heptachlor would kill neonate wireworms for up to 13 years in the soil. 13 years. But what I think is happening now is those insecticides have finally gotten to such a low level now in the soil that the neonates can now survive. Okay. Now this is why wireworms have been kept in check for decades, even after the OC ban in the 1970s. But this doesn't appear to be the case in PEI anymore. But we have had fields in British Columbia where we have no wireworms where you would expect them. I've had the soil analyzed, and there's still residues of dieldrin and DDT in them, enough to kill the neonates. Okay. So if eggs are laid in a suitable field with a suitable host, this becomes a problem. When, say, for example, grass or cereal crops are in rotation with other high-value crops susceptible to wireworms, such as potato or sugar beets or whatever, or carrots. So what else might be happening in terms of click beetles and egg laying in PEI? Well, I've got a hypothesis. It's kind of a worst case scenario. I don't want to freak you out, but I think that things are going to get worse here before they get better. Click beetles are now not just emerging from those permanent grassy habitats on the side of the fields. They're now emerging from within the fields themselves. So in your problem areas, your hotspot areas, I think you've got click beetles now coming out of the fields. And when they come out in these fields, if you happen to have potatoes in that field, or if you happen to have carrots, or I think any crop in a field that the click beetles come out in, they're going to lay eggs in that field. Okay? It might not be their preferred crop, but I think they're starting to lay eggs in other crops besides the cereals. And we've confirmed that in potatoes in BC, where we have a lot of neonates the year after a potato crop. And if this emergence from fields coincides with, say, a cereal crop, which is their preferred egg-laying host, and you've got all these immigrant beetles coming in as well, and beetles coming out of the field as well, egg laying is going to be exponential in those areas. And this is why I think we're starting to see a real explosion in wireworm problems and damage. Okay, so for example, the coming year, if you had a cereal crop in 2010 that was invaded by click beetles and eggs laid at that time, it takes about 4 years for the next group of adults to come out. So they'll be coming out in 2014. And then you've got all this immigration coming in from the edges. You're going to have massive amounts of eggs being laid. And then if this field goes into potatoes, you've got a huge problem to try and combat with a single chemical, which is thimet. And I don't think thimet is... Thimet will control most of your damage if you have moderate to low populations, but if you have a huge population, the population is going to break through. Put another way, the former click beetle breeding ground, which was limited to non-farmed areas, surrounding fields, has likely expanded to virtually all farmed areas in the hottest wireworm problem areas of PEI. Okay, let's talk about the wireworm stage. Once you've got them in a field, they'll attack many economic crops, which Brian said. And they'll attack, of course, pasture, corn, maize, cereal crops, and vegetable crops. Carrots, we're hearing about carrot damage right across Canada. Onions in British Columbia. They'll attack radishes. They'll attack rutabagas. They will attack strawberries. They'll actually crawl right into the strawberry. In BC, they were crawling right into the strawberries. The strawberries were picked and sent off to the processor. And the processor sent them off to plate yogurt. And all of a sudden, people were finding wireworms in their yogurt. We almost lost our strawberry industry. And of course, potatoes. I had a visit a couple years ago by a couple of gentlemen from Shanghai who were having huge problems with wireworm damage in their bamboo. In British Columbia, we have problems in our hedging cedars. They're in everything. Christmas trees. Wheat. This is what they'll do to a wheat crop. And Ted Laboon will be talking about this after me. But they can be devastating. This is a wheat trial with various insecticides. And all of the registered insecticides for wireworm control failed in this trial. This is a product that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. But moving on. Resident wireworms, okay, their activity periods. Resident wireworms are those that are in the soil at the time of planting, okay? So that's what this talk is about. I'm not talking about neonates right now because they have a different behavior. So wireworm activity and movement in soil profile. In the winter months, where are they? Well, between November and March, it's very cold. And we're just going to pretend here that this is the soil surface. And then we're going 6 inches deep and 12 inches deep. And that's where your wireworms are going to be. They're going to be deeper so that they can avoid frost and cold. They don't like to freeze. So wireworms are deeper at that time. And they can be up to 2 feet deep, which has been reported in literature, even up to 3 feet, depending on the species and the area. So in the spring months, this is when they wake up, when the soil temperature is above, say, 10 degrees, between 5 and 10 degrees Celsius. And at that point, they're hungry. Okay, they've been sleeping all winter. So at that point, they move up to the surface. And at that time, they're looking for anything that's producing carbon dioxide, such as germinating weeds, wheat, or germinating potatoes. So they're moving upwards to feed at that time. And that happens, say, between April and June. So in the summer months, after that period, after they feed, they have to go down and molt. And also at that time in the summer, it's very hot and dry. And those conditions will kill wireworms. And they know it, so they'll move down deeper once again. And at that point, they're no longer responsive to carbon dioxide. So if you want to try and trap them at that time, you're not going to have very good success, okay, because they're down deep. They're molting, they're not feeding. They have to feed to be attracted to your traps if you're going to do any bait trapping. Okay. Now what about the fall? Well, the fall, it's now cooler and you're starting to get your late summer rains, your early fall rains. The wireworms like those conditions, and once again, they're hungry. And we found in BC that about 100% of the resident wireworms will move up and feed at that time. We used to think that just a fraction of the residents would come up and feed in the fall, but we've proven that almost 100% come up and feed. Okay? So they're highly responsive to CO2, and this is when, of course, you've got your daughter tubers. So mother tubers coincide with spring feeders. And they don't usually reduce germination, although in some cases they have in enormous populations. And also at this time, this is when you plant your potatoes. This is when your insecticides like thimet will do the most damage to wireworms. And we know that 100% of wireworms at some point are going to come and feed on those mother tubers because they're hungry. As long as there's not something else for them to feed on in that field, they'll hone in on those the carbon dioxide produced by the mother tubers. And this is also a time when your pesticides, such as thimet, are the strongest. Obviously, you've just put it in, so that's when your material is the strongest, and that's when it's going to be the most lethal. And it's also in an area where the wireworms are honing in on, which is where your mother tuber is. That's where your thimet also is. Okay, so you're basically attracting them to their death with the mother tubers. Now, daughter tubers, if they're present in September, they coincide with fall feeders. And fall feeding occurs over a prolonged period. It can happen from the end of August all the way to November. And the longer potatoes are in the soil at that time, the higher the damage. So as soon as you can get your potatoes out of the field, get them out. Okay, don't leave them in there even a week longer than you need to. And this just backs that up. This is a pesticide trial that I did in 2005. The first arrow shows the first harvest on September 19th. And so you had about 10 blemishes per tuber. And then about 23 days later, you're up to almost 25 hits per tuber. And we see that each and every year. Also, daughter tubers often grow outside of the initial treatment area. So when you put your thimet in, it's in a tight little band with your mother tubers. The daughter tubers lie outside of that. And so you don't get a lot of contact. If there's any wireworms still surviving at that time, you don't get much contact at that time. Also, the treatment levels are now diminished with something like thimet. 90 days, 100 days down the road, you don't have a whole lot of it left. Okay, neonate wireworms. Those are the little guys that are formed from eggs laid that spring and summer. And they're very, very small and delicate at that time when they're produced. And they have to feed very quickly after they hatch. And they can't be in dry soil or they'll die. They're very delicate. And they feed near to the surface on whatever crops are available. And that's why click beetles like to lay their eggs in grass, because there's lots of host material for their babies. But they'll also lay eggs in cereal crops, in potatoes even. And they'll feed on the tissue, the haulms and what have you of the potato. So they feed in summer after hatching. They cause little to no damage to crops because they're very small, about 5 millimeters long. But they're very susceptible to tillage activities in August. So in PEI here, most of the hatching is going to happen in August. If you happen to till your crop at that time, you'll be killing most of the neonates. So certain crops are meant to be tilled or plowed under or whatever in August, such as buckwheat, correct? Yeah, and mustards, and that's probably doing a lot to kill the population off as well. Now, wireworms are attracted to carbon dioxide, and this is a very important principle for you to know because it'll help you to understand how control mechanisms work for wireworms. So, for example, if you plant wheat, the wheat is going to produce carbon dioxide, the seed, and the spring wireworms are going to be attracted. They'll move in. They can hone right in on the seed. They'll feed, they'll kill that seed, and then they'll follow CO2 plumes from adjacent seeds, and so on. But this is how they operate. And the same thing would happen with mother tubers. So this is important to know for sampling. So wireworms are attracted to various baits that you put in the ground because those baits produce carbon dioxide. So whatever bait you want to use, that bait has to produce carbon dioxide for it to be effective, okay? So you can put, I've dug holes, okay, 6 inches deep. I put a cup of flour in that hole, covered it up, put a stake in it, and come back in about 5 or 6 days, and I've got maybe 70 wireworms in that. Wireworms don't like flour, okay? They like the carbon dioxide that's produced by the microorganisms that are produced on that flour, okay? So it's the carbon dioxide produced by the microorganisms that are feeding on your bait that actually attracts them, not the bait itself, right? And this is what we use in our scientific studies. We use these pots with vermiculite. We have corn, we have wheat. Wheat germinates before corn, so you get kind of a relay effect on the carbon dioxide production. And you top it up and bury it in the ground. And that bait produces carbon dioxide and attracts wireworms. And it's a very consistent trap, which is what we need for our scientific studies. How am I doing for time, Brian? Am I rambling on? I'm good. And then we take those bait traps and we put them in these funnels, and the funnels extract every wireworm out of that bait. And it's very good for extracting those little neonate wireworms, which are very important to our understanding of control as well as the residents. This is up in the Okanagan in a sandy soil. That's where I put a cup of flour in a hole, covered it up, and you end up with these muffins or dumplings here after about a week, and they're loaded with wireworms. So 6-inch deep hole, 4-inch diameter, 1 cup of white flour. After 4 to 5 days even, you start getting attraction. And we put them out in this field. I was trying to mass trap them so I could do some lab studies. So all of these dumplings we brought back and extracted the wireworms, and we had about 6,000 Limonius canis that we could do our studies with. And you can also use that sort of system here if you want to find out whether or not you've got wireworms. But baits work best when wireworms are up and feeding. Obviously, you don't want to go in the middle of summer. You don't want to go in winter. You want to go in those spring months where you have about the soil being higher than 10 degrees Celsius. And you also don't want any competing carbon dioxide sources. So you don't want to just dig a hole in grass and put your bait in the grass, because all the wireworms will be in the grass, which is also producing carbon dioxide, and they're happily feeding. They're not going to leave the grass where they're at to go to your bait. So a rule of thumb, so competing CO2 sources, green manure in the ground, nearby grass, and you don't want to have competition with your bait trap for about a meter away. Okay, so you want to have a clear area about a meter from where your bait trap is going to go. Okay, if you have CO2 sources other than your mother tubers in potatoes in a field, this might affect how your thimet is going to work. So if you have green manure, okay, I'll just show you. What happens when you go directly from pasture into potatoes? In the spring, the wireworms are near the soil surface and they're feeding on various grasses, weeds, or winter cover crops. And they're attracted to the carbon dioxide in those areas. When you plow that, if you happen to plow that too soon before you're planting potatoes, you're going to have a lot of green manure in the soil. And some growers do this in British Columbia. And when you plow your field, basically you're flipping what's on the surface to about a foot below ground. And so you're flipping the wireworms underground as well. So if the vegetation isn't completely killed before plowing, the wireworms are going to remain with the green manure until it rots away due to continued presence of carbon dioxide. So what happens when you plant? Well, the wireworms are mostly preoccupied with the green manure during planting. You put your potatoes in with your thimet. The mother tubers produce carbon dioxide. And although you might use thiamet at that time, you're not going to kill many wireworms because the wireworms are not inclined to leave the area where they're feeding to go to the mother tubers. And we need to get really good control with thiamet early in the season, as I mentioned, because that's when thiamet is the hottest, and that's when you can attract them to the mother tubers. But if you're not attracting them to the mother tubers, then you've got a residual population that's going to get you later on. So in mid-season, the crop is growing. The green manure is rotting, but the wireworms are not inclined to feed at that time, okay, because it's summer. So the green manure is rotting away. You might get some feeding on the developing tubers, but not usually a whole lot. But when you get tuber initiation and daughter tubers happening in the fall, when the populations then come up to feed, and there's no more green manure in the field for them to feed on, then they'll move up and they'll feed on your daughter tubers. And if you haven't killed enough of them with your thiamet at that time, then you're going to have a lot of damage. And I don't know if anybody's experienced this, but there's a lot of evidence for this in British Columbia potato farming. Okay. And once again, the longer you leave the potatoes in the ground, the more damage you're going to get. So the best option when you're trying to get the best bang for your buck with thiamet is to make sure that your field is well fallowed and you don't have a lot of competing carbon dioxide in that field. So you get rid of any sources of carbon dioxide when you plant your potatoes. And so if you've got a field in pasture that is going into potato, you don't necessarily want to plow that in the fall. If you want to have your say pasture serve as erosion control, you can kill it off in the fall and leave it, and then plow it up in this, or work it up in the spring. And this also applies to late summer or fall seeded cover crops. You can try killing the grass cereal crop in the fall or early spring, and then disking, not plowing the dead material prior to planting. And this is what some farmers are doing in BC. Might be a different situation here because you have a longer winter than we have. So if you've gotten rid of all of the competing vegetation in the field and you plant your potatoes with either granulars or in-furrow sprays or seed piece treatments, you're going to get a better draw of the wireworm population and a better kill if the insecticide happens to be lethal, like thiamet. All right? So, knowing what we now know about the biology and behavior of click beetles and wireworms in a general sense, how can we better understand the situation in PEI? What's happening here? Why are wireworm problems expanding so rapidly and causing so much damage in PEI, apparently relative to any other area that I know of in North America? Well, we've got multiple species, and Brian mentioned that. We got 3 European introductions known to be huge potato problems, especially Agriotis spatata, which seems to be your main pest, well, which is your main pest here, and it's exploding. You also have ample non-farmed grassy breeding grounds, and you also, at this point, have click beetles coming out of actual fields, as well as the non-farmed grassy breeding grounds. Field soil is no longer toxic to wireworms with the organochlorines. And the field dimensions of fields are not overly large, so it's easy for beetles to invade from the outside in. Cereal crops have been commonly used in rotations in PEI with potatoes, and this, I feel, is one of the big causes for the wireworm explosion that you're having here. Lindane is no longer registered on cereal crops, so you can't use anything on cereals to kill them. Also, foliar insecticide spraying is not generally done in cereals anymore, or cereals or potatoes, which would kill click beetles. And yep, the same thing with potatoes. You're using neonicotinoids at planting, and so you're not really spraying your potatoes a whole lot. In the past, you used to put a lot of sprays on potatoes, which would have killed the click beetles. Any click beetles coming in would have been killed by these routine sprays. And also, neonicotinoids do not kill wireworms. So the use of Admire in furrow, or Titan in furrow, or as a seed treatment, will not kill any wireworms in the field. It'll stun them, but it won't kill them. Okay, so knowing what we now know about the biology and behavior of click beetles and wireworms in a general sense, how can we better bring the situation under control in PEI? And that's what we're going to be talking about in the afternoon. You're going to have to stick around.
If anybody has any questions for Bob, Kevin?
Just wondering, Dr. Vernon, when you show the map of wireworm damage in Canada, it's in every other province, but yet I don't hear the complaints from growers that it's affecting them as much as it is in the other provinces as it is in this one. So I'm just wondering if you could comment on that, why it's really affecting PEI in terms of the damage more so than the other provinces. I mean, other provinces have cereals in the rotations. Other provinces have some conditions that are close to ours. So could you comment on that, please?
Well, BC was where you guys are now. BC was there, I think, in the early 1990s. So we were having huge problems as well. And we, and it was because of the problems in BC that growers started using Thimet and to keep the problem under control, but that ended up getting into the food chain and killing eagles. So that's why we lost Thimet. But we have, and I'll be talking about this later, but we came up with an alternative to Thimet for BC. So the farmers are able to control it fairly well. And we only have really one species per field usually in BC. Sometimes there's Agruides obscurus and there's Agruides lineatus. And normally we'll have like a pile of lineatus in a field or a pile of obscurus. So we're dealing with one species, which makes our situation different than yours. The same thing on the prairies. They're not having that big a problem in potatoes, even though potatoes are under pivot irrigation on the prairies, and they're following cereal crops. Thimet seems to be holding the damage down, and that's probably because they have one species that is quite sensitive to Thimet. Okay, and that's Agruides or Limonius californicus, which takes over an area if it's irrigated. So that's why things aren't as bad on the prairies, even though there's a lot of problems in cereal crops themselves, which Ted Laboon's going to be talking about. The problem on the prairie is wireworms in cereal crops, not in potatoes. It's not as big a problem in Manitoba. It's a growing problem in Manitoba, but it's not at the point that they're at in Alberta, in Manitoba. So it's not as big a problem. The populations aren't out of control. Ontario and Quebec, my suspicion, they're starting to see more and more wireworm problems in Ontario and Quebec, and I think they're behind the rest of the provinces in terms of the problem emerging because of the heavy organochlorine use in those provinces in the past. they're starting to see problems, but it's not out of control. And a lot of the farming area in Ontario and Quebec, I do not believe they have extensive cereal crops in rotation with potatoes. I don't know why they don't have a problem in New Brunswick. I have no idea, absolutely no idea. It's not even on their radar screen. And we don't even get samples sent from New Brunswick to us because it's just not a problem. So I have no idea. Nova Scotia went through this about 15 years ago. And they also had the same European species that you have. But it's for all of the reasons that I said here, some of which are unique to PEI, like all of your different species, and your rotations in the past that I think are causing the problems to explode. You're welcome.
Yeah, Dr. Vernon, has there been any success in any work done on controlling the click beetle? It's about the only time of the cycle that they're above ground.
I'm going to be talking about that a little bit later, but they've done work on that in the Netherlands. They didn't really complete the studies, but they did show that, and I'm going to be showing some graphs of this, but they did show that if you've got a field of barley or seed grass, and you time a matador spray, it's called karate, okay, in Holland. But if you time a pyrethroid spray according to pheromone traps, then you can almost zero out the populations of click beetles. I believe that we could do the same thing here. What we have to do, and I'm going to be doing some work on this, and I'll mention this later, but we are going to be looking at spraying fields of pasture with matador at different times, timed by pheromone traps, to see if we can zero out the population of clicks before the females can lay eggs. And so at the end of the summer, we're going to be going in and taking cores in the pasture to see if we've been able to reduce the number of neonates that are produced in our various plots. So we're heading down that path, and it's kind of a desperation move, really, to have to resort to spraying click beetles, because it's a pay-it-forward strategy. It's not going to do anything to control the resident populations in your field right now. But 4 years down the road, if you do it every year for 4 years, assuming you've got click beetles coming out of your field all the time, if you time your sprays every year for 4 years, then at the end of that 4 years, if you've got good female control, then you're not going to have wireworms in the field. So that's the theory. We don't have anything registered for click beetle control yet, but we are working in that direction.
Yeah. Dr. Vernon, do you think we would have an advantage with thiamate if we could apply it, say, at hilling time as compared to at planting time on late variety potatoes like russet Burbanks? Because we have, it would seem that, as you mentioned earlier, that the thiamate is running out by the time we really need it. Would that be an option if we could obtain registration to put it on at a later time at cultivating time or hilling time?
It's worth a try.
With thiamate?
It's worth a try. I know they do it in the U.S. Brian was saying that it's on the label for potatoes using that method. I know it's used in sweet potatoes following that approach because they have a different species that goes through its life cycle in 1 year. They have to have something close to the surface, and so they run thiamate in adjacent to the crop later on. So it might have some merit if you could get some stuff on the if this is your hill, if you can get some in down here, because the wireworms are going to be coming up later on, then they're going to have to go through that. It might be worth a try or some trials.
Back to John's question on spraying the pyrethroids on the clicks. One concern I would have is, although they're supposed to come out in a peak, we see them in PEI. The clicks seem to come out over like a six week time period. So trying to get them all, I don't know if that would work or not.
What I'm thinking is that pheromone traps can help with that, and you can either use pheromones, and I'm just being hypothetical right now because we're not allowed to do that right now. But theoretically, you can do it on a field by field basis. Okay, if you've got a field that you're concerned about, or you can do it on a regional basis. And if you do it on a regional basis, then theoretically you can pick a couple of satellite fields or a few satellite fields in the area, and you can time when spatotter has started to come out. You add 15 days onto that. That's when you would put your first spray on. And then 2 weeks later you would put another spray, and 2 weeks later you would put another spray. That should cover the entire emergence period and egg-laying period of the females.
Dave?
In theory. A chemical like Matador, for example, does have registration on most crops for 3 sprays. And but we still have to figure out what sort of effects those pyrethroid sprays are going to have on beneficials. Because pyrethroids are very harsh on beneficials, but spraying earlier in the year is when you want to apply pyrethroids. So it seems like a good fit for the future.
Dr. Vernon, my question was plowing green manures down in the spring. So if I understood you correctly, we would use a desiccate to kill the crop in the fall if we were going to till it in the spring. Is that what you meant?
That's if it's possible to do that, that's what I would do. If you've killed the crop, and as long as you don't plow it, that you work it with like a disc or whatever, and you plow into that, or you plant into that. If you can do that, then you'll avoid having that CO2 producing manure in the ground. So if you do kill it off in the fall, then it's still there to retain moisture and take care of your erosion problems in the fall.
Thank you.
Is that it? Did that answer your question? Or?
Well, I think it's the green manure that we cannot have when we plant our crop. I think that's the deterrent, if I understood you right, because the wireworm will feed on the green manure, and then it's healthy and hungry when our daughter tubers are
Yes.
closer to harvest time. Is that?
Yeah. And even going back, when I first started working on this, I would talk to the farmers, and they say, most of my wireworm problems are in fields that I've converted from pasture into potatoes. And he said, but the funny thing is that the second year is always worse than the first year. So you plow down your green manure, then they plant their potatoes, and they don't get as much damage in that crop as they do the following year. And that's because the green manure is, I guess, breaking down over summer, and you don't get the full population in the first year going to the daughter tubers. The second year, you don't have anything in the soil except for the mother tubers that you're planting. And if you don't use anything at that time, then basically all the wireworms have to feed on is potatoes. And that's why they get even more damage in the second year.
Just one more. Is there different varieties of potatoes that attack wireworm differently?
Yes. There's been some work done in Korea as well as, I believe, Norway and Scotland, looking at different varieties. And some varieties are, I'm going to say, more resistant but they'll still get damaged, but there are some that don't get as much damage. And I can't give you any names of you know, the more resistant varieties, but yeah, that there has been some of that work done. And I can find that out for you if you want.
Another question: if you plowed a bit earlier, let's say in like August, mid to late, would that have any effect on, like, maybe if you were fall plowing, moldboard plowing in August, maybe that stuff would break down enough, let off some CO2 that by the time spring comes around, your thimet might work, or would that not be effective
Well,
either?
I would always make sure that I killed off anything that I was going to plow down and let it brown up. And plowing is a bit of a problem because I've seen fall plowed pasture still pretty much intact, although brown, the following spring. So I'm not sure what the situation is like here. It's going to be different because you've got different soil conditions. But whatever you do, just make sure that you don't have anything that is rotting in the ground at the time that you plant your potatoes.
Yeah, I think right now we generally plow in November, late October, and if I move that ahead a couple months, when the ground would be warmer and more of the microbes would be going, maybe it would help break down that layer of stuff before winter came, so it wasn't rotting in the spring. It would already be, you know, perhaps farther along, getting broken down come spring.
Yeah, that's possible.
Bob, you talked about wireworms moving in from the edge of fields, and as you know here, we have a lot of, we've promoted buffer zones a lot. We do a lot of farmable berms. We have a lot of terraces and whatnot. So we do have, potential for erosion on some of our fields. We've put a lot of work into soil conservation. Just some comments on how you'd manage those areas that you said could be basically contributing to the breeding of the click beetles as we try to balance it with our erosion and soil sustainability issues like we've talked about.
You're asking what we could do in the permanent habitat areas?
Yep.
Not much. But okay, having said that, we are looking at ways of reducing wireworm populations in the permanent habitats. So I've done a trial already. I've just published it showing that you can reduce click beetle populations by 85% using mass trapping. So we've got pheromone traps for the 3 key European species. And I'm going to be doing, I'm starting another study this year to find out what the optimal spacing is for the lineatus traps, the obscurus traps, and the sputator traps. And so, and I'm also developing a new beetle trap that is more disposable and cheaper, so that you can put these out in the grassy habitats, the permanent habitats, and suck in all the males before they get married, right? And so this is something we're looking at. We're also looking at using metarhizium, and that's what Todd Kabaluk is working on, to see if we can either spray or put it in granular form with pheromones to attract the various European species to granules that contain metarhizium that would kill them. So we're looking at a number of options that should be transportable to PEI. And once again, that's a pay-it-forward strategy. You're not killing any of the wireworms, but you're taking out the click beetles before they can invade the adjacent fields.
You mentioned the potato growers in BC were started disking as opposed to moldboard plowing. Just wondering, are they seeing improved results of their chemical control when they're disking as opposed to plowing? I
can't comment on that. All I know is that the potato farmers have their problems under control. Where they don't have their problems under control is where they're rotating pasture with potatoes. And I talked to one guy last week at the Growers Short Course, and he's a dairy farmer as well as a potato grower. And so he goes from either forage or grass into potatoes. And so all I can tell him is, make sure that when you do plant your potatoes, that you don't have any competing sources of carbon dioxide in your field. Get rid of any green or brown manure in your field before you plant your potatoes, and you'll get good control. In BC, they use a combination of chlorpyrifos in spray, or spray in furrow, along with Titan seed treatment, and they get extremely good control.